Alan, thank you for so much for joining the Heroic Gent podcast, which we're just beginning here. And you are one of the heroic gents who's contributing to this new idea, the show Men How to Be Men in Today's America, which unfortunately is greatly needed from what I could see.
Yeah.
We have some outstanding examples of men in this nation, but there's a class of people who really need this kind of conversation and help. Honestly, I think we all need this kind of conversation and help. And director, actor, you've done so much in the film industry. I've really been looking forward to this conversation to talk to you about America's iconic roles in film of and how that has shaped manhood, affected manhood over time, over the last century. So first, introduce yourself, tell people who you are, what you do, and then let's jump into this.
Well, I'm first of all really excited to be a part of what you're trying to do with the Heroic Gentleman. I think it's a very interesting idea. It's a very potentially controversial topic and concept to deal with.
But trying only to stay on controversial the high road all the time. We'll see.
Yeah, but it's only controversial because there's become so much confusion about what being a gentleman is, what being a man is, what that means, what manhood means. So I think the timing is good, and so it's an exciting effort to be a part of. So anyway, my background, I have been involved in film and video production for about 35 years now, and have done everything on a film set. I've had the opportunity to do craft services, to do makeup, to do wardrobe, to write, produce, and direct. So that's one of the places that I love to be, is on a film set with creative people who are committed and who want to tell good stories, inspiring stories, the kinds of stories that you can feel good and walk out of a theater or step away from your computer and feel like you've been inspired or maybe even just escaped for a while in a positive way. So that's what I do. Well, and then additionally, the way we connected was first through the filmmaking and then through writing. I enjoy writing about the things that I love, which are the outdoors, some of those traditional pursuits that were handed down to me from my grandparents and my forefathers. Hunting, fishing, being out in nature is really important to me. And so I've appreciated the opportunity through your tutelage to be able to write about some of those things. So I'm excited to be here and talk
about each other. It's both ways. And right, we met in 2009 at a book party that I threw at my brother Richard's for my first book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Hunting, which is a real journalistic endeavor about manliness, traveling around the country doing that stuff. On film, we're both big classic movie buffs, and I sure am. But I think we should start by grabbing a real icon, like a John Wayne or Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood really comes after the John Wayne kind of icon. And John Wayne is even kind of late in the Western pantheon of film. But he's the icon everyone knows, and
right.
What was it, Red River, where who was the director who couldn't believe that John Wayne could actually act after Red River? Who directed Red River?
It's funny you asked me now, and it just all those things slipped my mind.
Me too, just poof, right out of my head. Yeah, but the iconic nature of his roles over and over again, and I've met people on the left who absolutely hate John Wayne, and I ask them why they hate John Wayne, and it's because he was just so American that he had a tall guy, straight back, and when he went straight after the bad guys, and people loved him for that. And unfortunately, part of the left that I wanted to just hates him for it.
I think it also, if you don't like John Wayne, I mean, you can talk about his performances and things like that. But in terms of his character and the individuals he portrayed, I think that part of the reason there's that negativity towards him from some sectors is because he represents things that have been presented over the last 30 years as being negative, toxic, wrong, and even evil. And so he has become something that those people have been taught is wrong and to be feared. And so I think when they see that, they are afraid of some of those, what would we call them? Instinctual habits, instinctual traits that society has tried to tell us are wrong. And that, the simplified way to put it is that, white man bad, white males are the cause of evil for everything. That's the extreme of it. And so John Wayne represents those things that they are afraid of. It's strength, it's loyalty, it's a belief in principles that traditionally were represented by the idea of America. And elites in education and entertainment have tried to flip the script so that those principles that represented America are evil, are wrong, are bad. And the reality is they're like I said, they've flipped the script. They're twisting those things. They're presenting them in an incorrect fashion. And I think John Wayne is one of those characters that represents those things. So
yeah, the manly stoicism that he's going to walk straight at the bad guys, at the problem, and
yeah,
potentially solve the issue. Though he dies in a bunch of his films.
yeah,
Trying to,
and it brings up this idea that one of those principles is: are you willing to pay a price to support principles, ideas that are bigger than you are? And you look around in the world today, and there aren't a lot of people who would do that, who would willingly step into danger and into a situation where they would be threatened. It's funny, I just watched a video today that they were saying was this sociology test. Had it set up where two guys would be walking down the street and they would, in front of people, they'd have a plant and like a young woman or a kid, and they would grab them as if it was a kidnapping. And some of them, they just picked the girl up and took her down an alley. Another one, they literally had an open trunk and were putting the kid in a trunk, and they were then filming the reactions of the people. And of all those reactions, I don't think 20% of the people even said anything. Most people just pretended like nothing happened. A lot of them walked away. There were only a couple of people that really tried to intervene there. And one of the reactions was really interesting. Guy and a girl walking down the street. Kidnapping thing takes place in front of them. The girl automatically goes to try and help. And the guy is like grabbing her and pulling her back, pulling her away from it. And she just turns, shoves him away, and runs over and just starts wailing on this guy who was putting this kid in the trunk. And then, of course, they stopped and said, "Hey, look, we've got cameras." Da, da, da. Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, I always grew up with the expectation that if something like that happened, it was my job to step in. But that was
this generation pulls out their phone and starts filming, is what they'll do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really true.
If a plant jumped up at me, I'd probably start laughing. If I saw him trying to put a kid in the trunk, I who knows what I'd do to the person.
Yeah,
my boxing or karate would come out, but
true.
A plant, it's obviously a joke.
Yeah, well, and as I think about it, there are interesting examples. You've got John Wayne, you've got Gary Cooper, who's a little bit more. He's a little different. You think about High Noon and his character there. Jimmy Stewart's character, and the man that shot Liberty Valance. You have these kind of juxtapositions, and whereas John Wayne was maybe the more active role, you had a Gary Cooper who was
a more simple character, other than the Red River and a few other roles. In The Searchers, where he walks away at the end, is a complicated fissure in him that's breaking apart.
Well, and he's a very violent, angry, in some ways not a terribly admirable character in that, except for the fact that he sees a wrong that's been committed, and he realizes it's his job to try and make it right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and clean characters like you mentioned, High Noon, Gary Cooper, Grace Kelly. He stands up when no one will, and it's beautiful. I mean, how many men would? And everyone's telling him to leave town, and he just won't do it, and he continues on. Then you end up with Clint Eastwood, The Man with No Name, and that very dark, cynical, selfish character, who I love. I think we all love. But he's not John Wayne, and he's not Gary Cooper and all the films that he did. He's different. He's new, and now we're getting into the 70s spaghetti westerns, and things change as manliness and his treatment begins to really change.
Yeah, it's Clint Eastwood is interesting. He's kind of this bridge character. My favorite is probably Pale Rider. Nothing like a good piece of hickory. Um, he's this cynical, stoic, um, physically not as overpowering as John Wayne, but still a man of effective action. And he takes action to right wrongs. But he's got that cynicism that I think is where you saw that in kind of the anti-hero. That's where, the 70s, that's kind of started becoming really
Dirty Harry
Dirty Harry.
films, and that Eastwood did, and absolutely.
Well, an Easy Rider, and that whole school of filmmaking out of the 70s. And I think that the 80s, we had kind of a break from that. There were some really interesting, more lighthearted.
They
Um,
got simple and kind of stupid. And I enjoyed those movies as a kid, right? But they got pretty
well, Back
dumb.
to the Future and some of those kinds of things that were really fun.
I liked Lethal
Let's
Weapon,
see.
and there was deep depth to that character,
Yeah,
Davis' character.
but then
Yeah, a lot of that stuff was.
you've had this whole movement that I think has peaked. But we had all of these dark anti-heroes, Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, The Sopranos, that were extraordinarily well done, well produced, well written, incredibly well performed examples of media, but very cynical examples of manhood. Yellowstone recently, Yellowstone was shot out here, and I auditioned for it a few times. I never got on it, but some of my friends did. Everybody was talking about it, how amazing it was, and so I thought, well, I got to see what this is all about. So I started trying to watch. I thought I'd do it chronologically. Went back to 1888 and then 1923 and those prequels to Yellowstone. And I thought it would have been impossible to make Harrison Ford an unlikable protagonist. But there was nobody in those series that was really worth watching. They were not good people. These were all people willing to do absolutely anything for their
This decade,
own.
Ford has not been a likable guy. He doesn't have that same swashbuckling
Yeah,
demeanor he had back in the '80s, and
yeah.
it's gone with him.
Well,
Yeah,
so all of those words, and the Duttons and the last part of it, in Yellowstone, these are not people that you want your kids to grow up to be like. These are bad people who do bad things and aren't opposed to killing people who get in their way, whether
yeah,
it's right or
Jamie is
wrong.
sure evil. What's the special forces characters who has a new show coming out? He was
Yeah,
somebody I would
U.S.
like as a
Marshal.
neighbor,
Yeah,
right?
Luke Grimes, I think is that actor.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
that's being shot out here, and one of my buddies, one of my best friends, he got a role on that, and so his episode's coming up in a couple of weeks, so we're kind of excited about that. Um,
Oh, wow.
so it just illustrates that every Hollywood took not just our gentlemanly, manly, heroic characters, but everybody, and turned them into these weird, negative, cynical characters. And just the other night, my wife and I were at a movie, How to Make a Killing. Is that right? Yeah, How to Make a Killing with Glenn Powell. Well crafted film, interesting, but it's about how this guy figures out how to kill his relatives so he can inherit the family fortune. And it's a dark comedy kind of thing. But after the end of it, my wife just said, I'm just tired of just the negative films. We don't get a chance to go to a movie and feel really inspired anymore. And that's really true. That's really true. Though I will say, I've seen a couple of films recently. Solo Mio with Kevin James. I'm not a romantic comedy guy, but it's a great little film. It's a really
There's a lot of great
simple,
movies being made
straightforward.
now. Um,
Yeah, and I think people are now going, wait a minute, let's. There is a need for it. There is a market for it, and I think we're
Finding
starting to
that
see
men
that.
today are all horrible in films anymore, but they were for a while. If you saw, especially a white guy, he was there. He was going to be weak. The woman
Yeah,
would be stronger. He'd get his butt kicked. He might take it well, he
yeah,
might not. But there was a period of film there where they were just manliness was
Well, we're
being
still
put
seeing
down.
that. There's still some of
I
that.
mean,
I
maybe
mean,
way back to Archie Bunker and come forward, but
yeah. Well,
yeah.
Disney has gotten so caught up in the message making instead of storytelling, and they're paying a price for it. They are absolutely paying a price for it. Disney is a shambles now, and it was specifically because they quit making the story the most important thing, and they made the message the most important thing. It's kind of interesting. Religious, Christian filmmaking 10, 15 years ago, it was the same way. It was the message, it was the message, it was the message, and story was secondary. And so they were just terrible movies by and large. And then you had Mel Gibson, who did Passion of the Christ, that was bringing all of the elements of good storytelling and filmmaking together with a spiritual religious message. And that opened the door. The Chosen has cracked that door wide open. And so now you're seeing the religious films that are figuring out and have figured out how to tell good stories with good characters that have some nobility to them. And Disney has completely fallen off gone completely off the rails.
Hmm. Gibson's out there talking about his next Passion of the Christ project that is being filmed. It's
Yeah,
being filmed right
he's
now.
filming.
I'm
They're
kind of
filming
excited
right
about
now in
it.
Rome. Yeah, I am too. It's the resurrection. I'm trying to find out if the sets that they're using over in Rome, if they're going to save those, if the studio is going to save those, because we may be shooting a film over there and we need some similar kinds of things. So I'm like writing letters and saying, going to be hanging on to any of those sets that we might be able to use.
Right.
So
Smart.
what
Yeah.
was the other one I saw? It's a little small film. It's called Truth and Treason, and it's the story of Helmut Hubner, who was a teenager in World War II in Nazi Germany in Hamburg. And because of his religious convictions, he confronted Hitler and the Nazis and was eventually caught and executed as a 17-year-old kid. And, this amazing example of someone who had principles and refused to give them up at the cost of his own life. And, 17-year-old kid. How many 17-year-olds do you know that would do that today? You know?
Yeah, and I don't think a
So
great film's ever been made on Bonhoeffer. There were some people that really did stand up to that. We don't really know those stories as we should.
Bonhoeffer, there was a film that came out last year. Was it last year? His didn't get a ton of play, but I think it was out in about 1,800 theaters, but didn't stay in theaters very long. So there are people now that are trying to do that. So keeping our fingers crossed.
Well, looking at the trajectory of this, then how men are treated in film, and then what that means iconically for this next generation. It's always the next generation coming up. I mean, I came up in the '80s, and Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger and all that were the big stars with very simplistic characters. And I look back at those films, and they really don't hold up, at least to me. I don't find them deep or very interesting. Um, but we've moved past that now, and things have gotten a lot more interesting. There's a lot of small films being made, great films being made outside the studios. I come across
Yeah,
things all the time that I hadn't heard of that are fantastic. I just saw The
yeah.
Professional the other night. I was surprised by it. It was very good.
What was it? What was the
Um,
film?
the Professional. I'm sorry, The Amateur. I said Professional. It's The
The
Amateur.
Amateur
Um,
with Remy Malek and yeah,
right,
yeah.
right.
Very simple little film, but yeah, I liked it too. I liked it too. I mean, those kind of films are hard because they require so much. I hate to say contrivance, but conveniences that you can always quibble with the plot. But I thought that
There's
he
several
played a
leaps
really
in
interesting
it that didn't make
character
sense.
and brings up this question of manhood. And I think that there's this idea that I think we're starting to see that manhood is more about, I think that idea of being true to principles and being willing to stand up for principles as opposed to just the physical package, right?
Hmm.
Because I look at my dad. My dad was not a big guy. He was not um, a boxer or a physical kind of guy. He stayed in shape and he ran that sort of thing. But he wasn't. You might have not. considered him in the John Wayne type of manhood, right? But he was absolutely committed to his family, absolutely committed to his faith, committed to his career, and you could count on him. And so those things are very manly. That is absolute manhood in my mind. One of the stories, when I was, oh gosh, I was probably 10 years old. I'd done some work for somebody and they'd written a check for me to pay me. It was like $10 or something. And I went to one of the banks here in the little town where I grew up, and I went to try and cash this check. I didn't have an account at the bank or anything like that, and it wasn't drawn on their bank. And the guy there at the behind the desk looked at me and he said, "Are you Bennett Peterson's boy?" And I said, "Yes." And he looked at the teller and he said, "You go ahead and cash that check." And so that was because of who my dad was, you know. So and it didn't have anything to do with any kind of Rambo ethic or anything like that. But it was just his commitment to honesty and being principled and trying to do what was right. So I'm hoping that that's where we're seeing manhood going. I do definitely think though that there is an element of that. You've spent a lot of time with self-defense and the martial arts. I think part of being a manhood is being prepared for those events that occur that we never want to occur, but that we can't pretend aren't there. And those events happen more frequently all the time. And so we do need
rare,
to be
but when you walk through society and you know you can handle yourself as a man, it gives you a certain air of confidence and real confidence. So if a situation does
yeah,
ever arise, and I obviously don't get in fights. That isn't something I
right.
do, but I go to the dojo with my son, and we do karate together. And I think it's good for him, and I think it's even at my age, it's good for me.
Yeah, well, and
But it does pop up. Well, for
don't you think that
example, a couple of years ago, I actually saved a drowning girl, and her kayak had
yeah,
flipped over, and she didn't have a life jacket on, and without thinking, I actually don't remember throwing my wallet and keys on the beach, but I did. And I went running into the water and plowed all the way out there because she was going under. And her mother was trying to come out and save her too. And her mother was just not physically really capable of doing that. And I got near her and I grabbed the kayak and I threw it near her. And then I dove down and it pulled her up. And then her mother came and she was almost underwater herself. And I got them both on the kayak and brought them back. And I'm standing on the shore after that. And I trying to that really just happened. It was just why did I act that way? And I'm glad I did. But you're tested and you just immediately react. And there's a guy standing next to me, wonderful
yeah.
individual, good father, but he didn't react. And he still says to me, "Why didn't I do anything? You just did it. Why didn't I do anything?" Is it practice? Is it
Well, it's
that old
that idea. Well,
Aristotle idea of good
it raises
habits?
an interesting question. Yeah, can you train yourself to do that, or is it nature or nurture? And the idea that comes to my mind is you think of the military training where the Marines run to the guns. That idea that instead of shying away from conflict, they go to the conflict. And I think the example that comes to mind is the idea of skill at arms. Similar to anyone that does, I think, martial arts training, the more that you really understand it, I think the more polite, they talk about the idea of a polite society. A well armed society is a polite society because people who really understand that understand the power and are much more hesitant to use it, much more willing to try and find other options, knowing that once you take those steps, sometimes they're irreversible. So there's a level of responsibility that comes with that. And the more training you get, the more understanding you
Look,
get, the more
it's the
time you spend
confidence
in
that brings
the
that.
dojo, the more you realize you have to be respectful.
You have to be humble to
So
be in there. But I grew
you're
up around fighters.
yeah, yeah,
So in the boxing gym and now in the dojo, and none of those guys were ever bullies. They were too confident. They didn't. It wouldn't even appeal to them. A bully came in the door, they wouldn't do well. in that crowd. In fact, that happened a few times where they didn't do well in that crowd, and they were
I think
gone.
the more you
Something about that
the more
training.
you understand that idea, yeah, the more you understand that idea and the responsibility behind it, and the more that is inculcated by senseis, trainers, instructors, um, the more gentlemanly we become. I hope, anyway.
With the right
I'm interested. What's your
rubric, yeah,
experience
it
been with
sure
your
does.
son? Yeah. What's the
Well,
experience been with your son as you're trying to
yeah,
introduce those
no, that
skills to him?
confidence that, he's 13 now, that he has because he's been in karate since he was 7, and of course I do a lot with him and talk to him a lot about how a man acts and what you should be doing, and I've had to read the right books and so on. Just wrote a book for him, Cool Heroes for Boys. Um, so there are things you do with him, but I've seen him grow, and he's unfortunately had to take on a couple of bullies. He got the best of them and didn't get in much trouble because the bullies were known problem kids. So it's benefited him, and he knows not to do that unless absolutely has no other. You back into a corner kind of thing. So it's been healthy. Let's bring this back to film though, because I'm culturally this is such a big question. Like John Wick, for example. I love the 4 films, the 4 chapters of it. I have problems with, especially the 4th one, and I find it as much as I enjoy them, I also find them cartoonish, and as the big a fan I am of Keanu Reeves, and he's the real deal, especially when it comes to shooting. I know people who have worked with him
Yeah.
at ranges, at training him, and he could compete in a professional 3-gun tournament and do really well. He's the real deal, but at the same time, it's a very simplistic character, and it starts to fall apart later in the film. So I don't know. That's one of the biggest franchises of the last decade. I don't know what that really does for our youth today. What do you think as a director and filmmaker?
Well, you raise a really good question. Jason Statham is another one like that, another franchise kind of guy that's that way. The Rock has done some of those kind of things. Vin Diesel, um, and I think we have to be careful because if you ask the Stahelski brothers about John Wick, if you ask Keanu Reeves about John Wick, and if you ask them, are they an example of manhood that we should emulate? I don't think they would say that that was the case. I think they would say this is a character, it's a film, it's for entertainment. Um, so I don't think we should look to them and say, okay, that's an example of man that we want to emulate. That's entertainment, right? Um, there might be parts of that that you'd like to emulate. Yeah, look, I'd like to be able to handle a gun the way Keanu Reeves does. I'd love to have the time to put that kind of practice and energy into it, just because I like that kind of thing. But I don't know that that makes me more of a man, so to speak. And I wouldn't use it for that. It would be just kind of personal interest.
Confidence does, though.
Um, so
Having the skills and competence to use them.
confidence, absolutely, sure, I will
No,
agree
I
with
mean,
that.
I didn't
But
say competence.
I think
You can actually use a firearm correctly.
competence,
It, yeah, it's a
sure,
very
yeah, I would
manly
agree with
attribute.
that. I would agree with that. Well, and competence, that can be applied to anything. That can be applied to a lot of things. The competence breeds confidence, and particularly when it's something that is physical and demanding, I think that is really an important part of growing up and maturing, is to be put in hard situations where you got to grit your teeth and get through the pain and the struggle. That's really important. And I think that that's part of the reason maybe why we're questioning what manhood is, because a lot of kids today have been stripped of those opportunities. Um, I was just thinking about this today. I'm one generation away from the generation that grew up in the Depression. My dad was born in the middle of the Depression. My grandparents were dry farmers. It was root hog or die. And so there's competence, confidence, accomplishment, dedication, loyalty that all kind of comes with that. Because we're in such an incredibly blessed society of ease, we've lost some of those things. And I think in film, the storylines have that. Um, these are not men that have been made by hard times. They're expert special forces operators that are fictionalized, you know. So so they're like you say, they're more caricatures than they are real characters. And I would say that some of the films in the past, some of those classics, had some of that caricaturization, but I think they were more real and more reflective of values and attributes that were a little bit more commonplace and could be more related to by that society because more people shared those kinds of challenging, difficult experiences that life brought with them as just the nature of society at the time. And we don't have that anymore. Does that any of that make sense? Am I making any sense
Yeah,
here?
those are easy. No, you are. Times have gotten a lot easier. They're soft, and until you've been physically tested, and rites of passage are being purposely cut from our society. I mean, scoreless soccer games
Yeah,
being one of the metaphors for it. But I've seen lots of kids come into the dojo where my son and I go and do karate, who they don't last more than 2 or 3 times coming in. It's too real for them. It's too physical. It's a very supportive group. It's a wonderful dojo. Um, but it's too, and it isn't even violent. Even the sparring itself is just a point scoring, game of tag more than anything else. And I remember growing up at a boxing gym. I was taught to box by Floyd Patterson. Was in a gym full of professional boxers, and that was real.
yeah,
You got hit in there, and you had to be able to take it. And Floyd would purposely put you in the ring when you were young, where you first came in, at least when the first few weeks were coming in, because he didn't want to spend his time training you if you were just going to quit after you got hit. So he wanted you to get hit. He
sure.
would have a professional boxer. With me, it was a middleweight named Mike Peoples. He purposely put me down. Um, and
Wow.
it was humbling and it hurt. And I came back. So Floyd kept training me. But that isn't like what it's like in the karate dojo I'm in. So it's a very protective, nice environment, but still it's too much for a lot of those kids. They're and their parents also aren't used to it.
Yeah,
Actually, interestingly, I'm finding it's the immigrant parents that are coming in that are much more willing to put up with the pain of the dojo than it is the soft, urban kind of American.
yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons why hunting and fishing have become even more important to me as time's gone on. You know, as a kid, it was just kind of the thrill of it and being with my grandpa and my dad, and then they were teaching me and kind of starting to plant those seeds. But now, one of the reasons that particularly hunting and fishing now are important is because you have to go out into nature, and I choose to go out um, into experiences that are not just driving up to the side of a lake, putting out your chair and throwing in a worm and just sitting there and watching the bobber. Um, I want to go someplace where I've got to hike back into it. I've got to get there, maybe a little bit difficult, and it tests me because I need that challenge. I need to be physically tested, and nothing does that better than Mother Nature. I mean, Mother Nature just shouldn't kill you, as look at you, and doesn't care anything about where you came from, who you are, treats everybody the same. And so to be able to get out there, to be, cold and wet and, but make it back and maybe have some success or be, hot, sweaty, tired and have, hiked up and down and gained thousands of feet in elevation and feel your lungs pounding. Um, those are important experiences that I want to still have to test myself and to learn from those hard experiences that society kind of tells us that we're not supposed to have anymore.
Well, that canyon you took me back into in Utah last September, the switchbacks, 4-wheel driving all the way down to it, and hiking over those big bouldering to get down to the pools and those gorgeous
Yeah,
waterfalls and catching trout with our fly rods in the bottom of them. That was an adventure. That's a beautiful
it
place,
really
but it
was.
will test you. Yeah.
Yeah, and
So
it's supposed
I'm
to.
wondering, you're a filmmaker, and we've been talking about the genre of film or what it means to manhood. Those icons. We didn't even talk about 007 and a million other characters that have shaped so much of
Yeah,
how people look at manliness today. As we look forward now, film is changing a lot, and I have a lot of hope in it. I study periods of film, and I love the 30s and 40s and
Yeah.
classic, great
Yep.
films from any decade. 50s are still very good. 60s, 70s, I think film was some great films. Don't get me wrong, but for the most part, really started to fall apart. They got weak and cartoonish in the 80s, and since then they've been pulling back. And lately, I'm pretty impressed with some of the stuff I'm seeing. So I'm wondering, as you look
Yeah.
forward, what do you think? Um, any thoughts on the shape
You
of
froze there
how
for me.
this is going to change culture as we go?
Well, I'll tell you what I hope happens. Technology has so democratized the opportunities to make a film. When I first started in the industry, if you wanted to make a good movie, you had to have $500,000 worth of gear just to get started, just to be in the game, at a minimum. But now I've got a movie studio right there. And the only thing that keeps an individual from making a movie or telling a story now is simply the decision to do so. And so I hope that means that we're going to get more variety of stories. We're going to hear more voices coming out. And at the same time, we're going to get an opportunity for voices that have been kind of stifled. That this idea of what really being a gentleman or a man means, well, we can go out and we can tell that story and we can go find an audience for it. We don't have to worry about gatekeepers anymore. There's still some of that, but there are certainly ways around it that have never been that way before. And so I'd like to think that some of the stories that are going to be told are going to be stories about noble characters who have to overcome great odds. And sometimes they have to do it physically, other times they have to do it mentally. And that those characters will come to represent manhood and not just the physical package of it. But you don't have to be a Sylvester Stallone or Dwayne Johnson to represent manhood. A little scrawny guy like me can represent that if it's
Mhm.
about doing what's right, standing up for what is good, um, and living by a code, principles, um, some sort of creed that is based on moral principles, then that is what I hope we'll start seeing more of being, the definition of manhood.
I don't think we need a filmmaking to give us an Odysseus or an Aeneas or a Roland. I don't think we need this mythological figure that is idealized and put up on this pedestal for us. I think the more nuance, the better, and more exploration of the character, the better. The
I
only thing that
agree.
worries me, as we've talked about several times here, is can we be honest about the character and the development, and who they are, and what they're trying to achieve, what their hero's journey is as they go through that process. If we can be honest, then we can do all the exploration and build the depth and the philosophy of what we're talking about, this manliness that we're talking about, the heroic gentleman. But if we can't be honest, if
Yeah.
woke kills, then boy, it dries up.
Well, and I think part of that honesty is the reality that we are imperfect. That as much as we strive for some of these characteristics and look for examples of heroic gentlemen, we are going to fall short at times. But in that imperfection, how we handle that imperfection, that's part of manliness. That's part of gentlemanliness, being able to be humbled and then learn and improve and try to be better and try to leave uh, an example or a lesson that someone coming behind us can learn from and not have to be making those mistakes. Make their own mistakes and leave other lessons for other people, but hopefully be able to learn from the things that we struggle and suffer through. Um, I was the Avatar movies are an interesting, um, I think, look at some of these kinds of issues. Um, the second Avatar film I really liked because it was the story of a father trying to care for his family. Kind of at the base level, it was this dad trying to take care of his family. which I really like because we hadn't seen stories like that. But at the same time, Cameron set up this society, the Na'vi, that was this perfect society. There was no, um, there was nothing negative. There was nothing challenging. There were no conflicts within that society. It was this paradisiacal, absolutely unreal example of what Cameron hoped society could be. And because of that, it didn't feel, there's this barrier. You can't really relate to it. Whereas if he'd taken that and demonstrated more of the flaws in that society, but how they tried to overcome them and tried to be better, knew they had flaws and tried to continue to be better, I think it could have been an even more powerful film. Who am I to say, a guy makes, $2 billion on a movie? It's hard to argue with that. But I hope that stories can, like you say, be real. Flawed characters who work to overcome their flaws are much more interesting than archetypes in many ways. I want to see
And they
people who are
always
like
have been.
me. And yeah, yeah,
That storytelling has been. They always have been more interesting. You know,
yeah,
even we started in classic Western, and I mentioned Red River a couple of times. That character John Wayne, he gets brutal and he's wrong and he's told he's wrong. Montgomery Clift almost shoots him, and they stop him
yeah,
and they take their herd from him because he's wrong. And there's a fight in the end between the two guys and John Wayne and Montgomery Clift, and it isn't until Montgomery Clift fights back that everyone takes a breath. Oh, okay, good. And that's the wonderful part. That physicality brings them back together. And John Wayne, that monster comes back. It falls off him again, and he becomes a man, becomes human. But he was certainly fallible through that movie.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. And we need to
Well,
recognize
we've
that in
come around to full
ourselves
circle.
and be willing to.
Yeah, we've come full circle around. Let's leave it there and find. I think we need to explore some of these topics more individually, and I think we can get deeper and have even more fun with it. I think we basically started with the survey course, but we have a lot of digging to do here. There's a lot more to talk about.
Well, with the books that you've written, the recommendations you made, I hope folks will check out your 100 books that every man needs to read that you put together. You could study those for multiple lifetimes and still not learn everything there is in those about these issues we're talking about. So there's a lot of content that could be created about that.
Very good. Thank you, Alan.
You're very welcome. I'll look forward to continuing the conversation.